The acrid smell of smoke still clung to Thomas Hayes's weathered coat as he guided his team of oxen through the dusty streets of Millbrook. Market day had begun like any other, with vendors hawking their wares beneath colourful canvas awnings and children weaving between the wagons with sticky fingers and bright laughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But in the span of mere minutes, celebration had turned to chaos, and a simple act of courage had set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the careful boundaries he had built around his solitary heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand market square, painting the red brick buildings in hues of amber and gold. Steam rose from fresh-baked bread, mingling with the earthy scent of autumn vegetables and the metallic tang of newly forged tools. Thomas had been securing his freight load near the church steps when the first screams pierced the cheerful din of commerce. Fire, that ancient enemy of wooden structures and human dreams, had erupted from a cooking stall and was devouring everything in its hungry path. Without thought for his own safety, Thomas had plunged into the smoke-filled chaos. His strong arms had carried James Brennan's unconscious form from the collapsing boarding house, then returned twice more for the man's children, 8-year-old Lucy and 6-year-old Samuel, their faces streaked with soot and terror. But it was the woman who emerged last from that inferno who would haunt his thoughts in the days to come. Catherine Brennan, known to most as simply Kate, had refused to leave until every soul was accounted for, her dark hair singed and her green eyes fierce with determination, even as the flames licked at her heels. Now 3 days later, as Thomas made his regular freight run to the mining camps in the foothills, he found his mind wandering back to those same green eyes. Kate Brennan was a widow, that much he knew. Her husband had perished in the silver. Greek mine collapsed 2 winters past, leaving her to run the boarding house that had been their shared dream. She was respected in town for her quiet dignity and tireless work ethic, but Thomas had never paid her much attention before the fire. He was a man who dealt in practical matters, loads to be hauled, schedules to be kept, and solitude to be preserved. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically against the packed earth road, a sound that usually brought him comfort. Thomas Hayes had built his life around predictability and distance. At 34, he had seen enough of the world's cruelties to know that attachment led to loss, and loss led to the kind of pain that could break a man's spirit. His freight business was successful precisely because he kept his relationships professional and his emotions locked away tighter than the strong boxes he sometimes transported. But something about that fire had cracked open a door he thought he had sealed forever. Perhaps it was the way Kate had thanked him afterward, her voice steady despite the tears tracking clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. Or maybe it was how she had immediately turned her attention to comforting her young niece and nephew, putting their needs above her own grief for the boarding house that now lay in charred ruins. Whatever it was, Thomas found himself taking an unusual route home, one that would carry him past the remains of the Brennan place. The late afternoon sun slanted through the bare branches of the elm trees that lined Cedar Street, casting dancing shadows across the blackened skeleton of what had once been the Brennan boarding house. Thomas brought his wagon to a halt across the street, ostensibly to check the security of his load, but his eyes were drawn to the figure picking through the debris with methodical determination. Kate Brennan moved like a woman accustomed to hard work and harder choices. She wore a simple grey dress, practical boots, and a faded blue shawl that had seen better years. Her hair, the colour of rich coffee with hints of copper, where the light. A corset was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, though rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. She was sorting through the wreckage with careful precision, placing salvageable items in a wooden crate beside her. Thomas found himself studying her with the same attention he usually reserved for evaluating a difficult mountain pass. There was something in her posture that spoke of resilience, born from necessity rather than choice. She moved with the economy, of motion that came from years of managing a household, of making every gesture count because time and energy were precious commodities not to be wasted. A sudden gust of wind sent ash swirling around her skirts, and she paused to cough, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. It was then that she noticed his wagon across the street. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like the settling of cargo when a wheel finds an unexpected rut. Kate straightened, brushing the dust from her hands, and walked toward him with the direct approach of someone who had no patience for social pretenses. Her green eyes held a mixture of gratitude and wariness that Thomas recognized in his own mirror each morning. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from breathing. Too much smoke. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. James is recovering well, and the children have been asking about you." Thomas touched the brim of his worn felt hat, uncomfortable with gratitude as he always was. "Just did what needed doing. Mrs. Brennan, no thanks required." "Perhaps not required," Kate replied, "but certainly deserved." She glanced back at the ruins of her home, and Thomas caught a flicker of something vulnerable in her expression before she composed herself again. "I suppose you'll be heading out on another freight run soon. The mining camps depend on men like you, especially with winter coming on." There was no judgment in her words, but Thomas sensed an underlying loneliness that matched his own. Here was a woman who understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of carrying on when everything familiar had been stripped away. "Actually," he found himself saying, though he had made no conscious decision to speak, "I was wondering if you might have need of some lumber. I've got connections with the sawmill up at Pine Ridge, and they owe me a favor or two." Kate's eyes widened slightly, and Thomas saw her pride war with her practical needs. The boarding house had been her livelihood as well as her home. Without it, she and her deceased husband's family had little means of support in a town where opportunities for women were limited. "That's very generous, Mr. Hayes, but I'm afraid I couldn't afford to pay market rates for lumber right now. The fire took most of my savings, along with everything else." Thomas shifted his weight, the wagon creaking beneath him. He was venturing into unfamiliar territory, the realm of personal connection that he had avoided for so many years. But something about Kate Brennan's quiet dignity compelled him forward. "Wasn't talking about payment," he said gruffly. "Was talking about neighbors helping neighbors. This town's been good to my business over the years." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Figured it was time I returned the favor." For a long moment, Kate simply stared at him, and Thomas wondered if he had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then her face softened, and he caught a glimpse of the woman she had been before. Loss and responsibility had carved lines around her eyes. "You're a good man, Thomas Hayes," she said quietly. "Better than most give you credit for." The use of his first name sent an unexpected warmth through Thomas's chest. In all his years of conducting business in Millbrook, most people addressed him formally, maintaining the professional distance he preferred. But something in the way Kate spoke his name suggested a recognition that went deeper than mere gratitude. "I'll bring the lumber by tomorrow," he said, gathering up his reins. "Figured we could start with the frame, get you and the family under a proper roof before the weather turns." Kate nodded, but Thomas could see the conflict in her expression. Her pride was at war with her circumstances, and he recognized the struggle because he had fought the same battle himself many times over the years. "Mr. Hayes," she called as he prepared to drive away. "Thomas, why are you doing this?" It was a fair question, and one he had been asking himself since the moment he had offered his help. Thomas considered his words carefully, aware that his answer would set the tone for whatever relationship might develop between them. Because, he said finally, sometimes a person gets a chance to do something right. Doesn't come along often, and it would be foolish to waste it. As he drove away, Thomas could feel Kate's gaze following him down the street. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from countless chimneys, but also the fresher smell of possibility that came with changing seasons. For the first time in years, Thomas Hayes found himself looking forward to tomorrow, to the prospect of building something, instead of simply moving freight from one place to another. That evening, as he sat in his small cabin on the outskirts of town, Thomas found himself planning the reconstruction of the Brennan boarding house with the same meticulous attention he usually reserved for mapping freight routes. He sketched rough drawings by lamplight, calculating board feet and nail requirements, but his thoughts kept drifting to green eyes and the sound of his name spoken without the usual barriers of formality. Outside his window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. Thomas set aside his pencil and walked to the window, gazing out at the town that had been his base of operations for over a decade, but had never truly felt like home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices that would push him further from the safe isolation he had cultivated. But for the first time since he could remember, the prospect of change did not fill him with dread. Instead, it sparked something that had long laid dormant in his heart, something that felt dangerously like hope. The lamplight flickered as a breeze stirred the curtains, and Thomas found himself thinking about the way Kate had sorted through the ashes of her old life with such determined grace. There was a lesson there, he realized, about the difference between simply surviving and choosing to rebuild. As he banked the fire and prepared for sleep, Thomas Hayes made a decision that would alter the careful course of his solitary existence. Tomorrow, he would not merely deliver lumber to Kate Brennan. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward building something that neither of them could construct alone. The night settled around his cabin like a familiar blanket, but Thomas lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind in the pines and feeling the steady, unfamiliar rhythm of a heart learning to hope again. In the darkness, he could almost see the outline of a different future, one that included not just the satisfaction of work well done, but the deeper fulfillment that came from sharing that work with someone who understood its true value. When sleep finally claimed him, Thomas dreamed not of empty roads and distant destinations, but of raising walls and laying foundations, of green eyes bright with possibility, and of a home that might finally deserve the name. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a whispered secret as Thomas loaded his wagon with lumber from the Pine Ridge sawmill. Each board had been hand-selected, the grains straight and true, the wood properly seasoned to withstand a harsh Colorado winters. He had risen before dawn to make the journey, telling himself it was simply good business practice to get an early start. But the truth lay deeper in the anticipation that had kept him restless through the night. By the time he reached Cedar Street, the sun had burned away the mist, revealing a town coming to life with the purposeful energy of commerce and community. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil, shopkeepers swept their storefronts, and the aroma of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Thomas guided his wagon to the vacant lot where the Brennan boarding house had once stood, the charred foundation stones still marking the boundaries of dreams interrupted. Kate was already there, wearing a faded brown work dress and leather gloves that had seen better days. She was not alone. James Brennan, her brother-in-law, stood beside her, his arm still bound in a sling from the injuries he had sustained in the fire. Despite his obvious discomfort, he was examining the foundation with the critical eye of a man who understood the importance of starting any project on solid ground. Young Lucy and Samuel played nearby, their resilience a testament to childhood's ability to find joy, even in the aftermath of tragedy. Lucy had fashioned a doll from rags and was conducting an elaborate tea party among the wildflowers that had already begun to reclaim the edges of the lot. Samuel, meanwhile, was building elaborate fortresses from the scattered bricks, his imagination transforming destruction into possibility. Thomas brought his wagon to a halt and climbed down, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground. Kate looked up at his approach, and he noticed that she had pulled her hair back into a practical braid that revealed the elegant line of her neck. There was something different about her this morning, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, and again he felt that strange warmth at hearing his name spoken without formality. "James insisted on coming to help, though I told him he should be resting." James Brennan stepped forward, extending his good hand in greeting. He was a man in his early 40s, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years working outdoors. His resemblance to his late brother was evident in the strong jaw and kind eyes, but where Kate's husband had been a dreamer, James struck Thomas as intensely practical. "Can't thank you enough for what you did during the fire," James said, his grip firm despite his injuries. "And now this kindness with the lumber. Kate tells me you won't accept payment?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the weight of gratitude. "Your family's been through enough without worrying about bills," he replied gruffly. "Besides, this town's treated me fair over the years. Time I returned the favor." Kate moved to stand beside her brother-in-law, and Thomas caught the subtle look that passed between them. There was a conversation taking place in that glance, a weighing of pride against necessity that he understood all too well. "We've been discussing the plans," Kate said carefully. "James has some experience with construction from his time working the railroad, and we thought perhaps we could modify the original design, make it more efficient, better suited to the changed circumstances." Thomas nodded, sensing the delicate nature of the discussion. The original boarding house had been built during more prosperous times, when Kate's husband had been alive and their dreams had seemed limitless. Now, with reduced means and increased responsibility, every decision carried weight. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, genuinely interested in their thoughts. James pulled a folded paper from his pocket, spreading it carefully on a nearby stump. The drawing was rough but detailed, showing a smaller structure that maximized space while minimizing cost. "Figured we could build smart instead of big," he explained. 3 guest rooms instead of 5, but with better insulation and more efficient. Heating, a common area that could serve multiple purposes. Kate traced the lines of the drawing with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "It would still provide income from boarders, but wouldn't require as much staff to maintain. I could manage it myself, with help from the children as they grow older." Thomas studied the plans with the practiced eye of someone who understood both construction and logistics. The design was clever, making use of every square foot while maintaining the welcoming atmosphere that had made the original boarding house successful. But more than that, it spoke to the kind of practical wisdom that came from facing hard truths and choosing to move forward anyway. "It's good thinking," he said finally. "Solid. You mind if I suggest a few modifications?" For the next hour, the 3 adults huddled over the drawing, discussing load-bearing walls and drainage, window placement, and roof pitch. Thomas found himself drawn into the conversation in a way that surprised him. Usually, his construction work was solitary, a matter of following established plans and completing contracts. But this felt different, collaborative in a way that made each decision feel important beyond its immediate practical value. Kate proved to have an intuitive, understanding of how people move through spaces, while James brought technical knowledge from his railroad experience. Thomas contributed his understanding of materials and mountain weather, the practical considerations that could make the difference between a structure that lasted and one that failed when tested by time and elements. As they worked, Lucy and Samuel gradually drew closer, their curiosity overcoming their initial shyness around the tall, quiet man who had pulled them from the fire. Lucy was the first to speak, tugging on Thomas's coat with the fearless directness of childhood. "Are you going to build us a new house?" she asked, her dark eyes serious beneath a fringe of auburn hair that reminded Thomas painfully of her aunt. Thomas knelt to her level, finding himself unexpectedly charmed by her earnest expression. "Well, miss, I'm going to help, but it'll be your Aunt Kate and your papa who really build it, with their planning and their hard work." Samuel, emboldened by his sister's example, stepped closer. "Will it have a big kitchen? Aunt Kate makes the best apple pie in the whole territory." "Samuel," Kate admonished gently, but Thomas caught the pleased flush that colored her cheeks at the compliment. "I imagine it'll have whatever kind of kitchen your Aunt Kate needs," Thomas replied, glancing up at her. "A good cook deserves good tools." The comment was casual, but it sparked something in Kate's expression, a recognition that he saw her not just as someone who needed help, but as someone whose skills and contributions had value. It was a distinction that mattered more than Thomas had realized it would. As the morning progressed into afternoon, they began the actual work of construction. Thomas had brought not just lumber, but the basic tools needed for framing. He worked with the methodical precision of long experience, but found himself pausing frequently to explain techniques to James, whose enthusiasm more than compensated for his limited mobility. Kate proved herself more than capable of handling supportive tasks, measuring and marking boards with an accuracy that impressed Thomas. She had clearly learned much from watching her husband work, and her movements showed the confidence of someone who understood that careful preparation prevented costly mistakes. The physical labor felt different than Thomas's usual solitary projects. There was conversation, questions, the occasional shared joke that made the work feel less like obligation and more like community. When Kate disappeared around midday and returned with sandwiches and cold lemonade, Thomas realized he had been so absorbed in the work that he had forgotten to eat. They sat in the shade of an old oak tree, the adults comparing progress, while the children chased butterflies among the tall grass. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on practical matters of construction, but gradually expanding to include stories of past projects, memories of the town's history, observations about the changing seasons. Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing anecdotes from his freight runs and his observations of the territory's development. Kate listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the complexities of his work. James contributed his own experiences from the railroad, and gradually a picture emerged of three people who had all learned to find purpose in honest labor. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Victor Caldwell arrived on his pristine bay gelding, his perfectly pressed suit and gold watch chain marking him as a man who valued appearance over substance. Caldwell owned the largest general store in Millbrook and held mortgages on several properties around town. His expression as he surveyed their work was one of barely concealed disapproval. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, dismounting with theatrical flourish, "I heard about your little building project. I have to say I'm concerned about the wisdom of this endeavor." Kate rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirts, her face carefully neutral. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. I wasn't aware that our rebuilding efforts were any concern of yours." Caldwell's smile was as polished as his boots and just as superficial. "Well, you see, that's where you're mistaken. As a prominent businessman in this community, I have a vested interest in maintaining property values and ensuring that construction meets proper standards. Sup. Thomas felt his jaw tighten at the implication, but he remained seated, allowing Kate to handle the confrontation in her own way. James, however, had no such restraint. "Are you suggesting that we're not capable of building a proper structure?" James asked, his voice deceptively mild, but with an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Not at all," Caldwell replied smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that Mrs. Brennan might be better served by selling this lot and finding more suitable accommodations elsewhere. I happen to know of several interested buyers who would pay fair market value." Kate's back straightened, and Thomas recognized the signs of a woman whose tolerance for condescension had reached its limit. "This is my home, Mr. Caldwell. It's where my husband and I built our life together, and it's where I intend to continue building my future." "But surely you can see the impracticality of the situation," Caldwell pressed. "A woman alone, trying to operate a business in these challenging times. Wouldn't it be wiser to cut your losses and start fresh somewhere else?" Thomas stood slowly, his considerable height casting a long shadow across the lot. He said nothing, but his presence beside Kate was unmistakable in its implications. Caldwell's eyes flicked between them, his expression calculating. "Of course," Caldwell continued, his tone becoming more cautious. "If you're determined to proceed, I suppose I could arrange for proper financing. The terms wouldn't be unreasonable, though naturally there would be interest to consider, and certain conditions about the quality of construction and the types of tenants you could accommodate." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Kate replied firmly. "We have the situation well in hand." Caldwell's gaze settled on Thomas with undisguised hostility. "I see you've found yourself a champion, Mrs. Brennan. I do hope you've considered the implications of accepting help from someone whose reputation in this town is hardly established." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Thomas felt the familiar urge to respond with force, to settle the matter in the direct way he had learned on the frontier. But something in Kate's posture, the way she stepped slightly forward, as if to shield him from Caldwell's words, gave him pause. "Mr. Caldwell," Kate said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention, "Thomas Hayes risked his life to save my family from that fire. He's offering his time and expertise to help us rebuild, asking nothing in return. If you can't see the honor in that, then I question your fitness to judge anyone's reputation." The rebuke was delivered with such calm dignity that it carried more weight than any angry outburst could have managed. Caldwell's face flushed, but he had been outmaneuvered and clearly knew it. "Very well," he said stiffly, remounting his horse. "But don't say I didn't warn you about the dangers of misplaced trust. This town has a long memory for those who don't know their proper place." As Caldwell rode away, Thomas felt something shift in the dynamic between himself and Kate. She had defended him, chosen his character over Caldwell's wealth and influence. It was a gesture that went beyond mere gratitude, suggesting a trust that ran deeper than their brief acquaintance should have allowed. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Kate met his gaze steadily. "I meant what I said. You're a good man, Thomas Hayes, whatever Victor Caldwell might think to the contrary." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, they secured their tools and covered the lumber for the night. The foundation of their new relationship, like the foundation of the house they were building, had been tested and proven sound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices that would further define the bond growing between them. But tonight, as Thomas drove his empty wagon home through the gathering dusk, he carried with him the memory of green eyes bright with determination and the sound of his name spoken in defense rather than mere politeness. the evening star appeared. On the horizon, a pinprick of light in the gathering darkness, and Thomas found himself thinking about the difference between solitude and loneliness, between independence and isolation. For years, he had convinced himself that the former was preferable, that safety lay in keeping others at arm's length, but today had shown him another possibility, the chance to build something that could weather any storm because it was founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. As he unhitched his team and settled them for the night, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just the satisfaction of work completed and freight delivered. It was a dangerous thought, one that opened him to possibilities he had long since given up on. But as he looked back toward town, where a few scattered lights marked the homes of families gathering for evening meals, Thomas Hayes found that he was no longer afraid of hope. 3 weeks into the construction, autumn had settled over Millbrook like a painter's masterpiece, transforming the cottonwoods into torches of gold and crimson. The boarding house was taking shape with satisfying progress, its frame rising sturdy and true from the foundation stones. Thomas had fallen into a rhythm of arriving each morning just as the sun cleared the mountains, working alongside James and Kate until the light began to fail. What had started as a simple act of charity had evolved into something more complex and meaningful. Thomas found himself looking forward not just to the satisfaction of construction, but to the conversations that flowed as naturally as the work itself. Kate had a gift for drawing stories from him, tales of his freight runs and encounters with the colorful characters who populated the mining camps and trading posts scattered across the territory. In return, she shared memories of her life before widowhood, painting pictures of a marriage built on shared dreams and mutual respect. Her husband had been a gentleman with an inventor's mind, always tinkering with improvements to make their boarding house more comfortable for guests. Kate spoke of him without bitterness, but Thomas could hear the loneliness that threaded through her words like a minor key in an otherwise hopeful melody. James had proven himself an able partner despite his lingering injuries, bringing both construction skills and a dry humor that kept the work light even when the labor was hard. The children, too, had become part of the daily routine, helping with simple tasks and providing entertainment during breaks with their boundless energy and imagination. But as the walls rose higher and the structure became more recognizable, as a future home, Thomas became aware of a growing tension in the town around them. Conversations would stop when he walked into Porter's general store, replaced by meaningful glances and whispered comments. Men who had once nodded cordial greetings now looked through him as if he had become invisible. The change was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or coincidence, but gradually it became impossible to ignore. Orders for freight services, once steady and reliable, began to dry up. Customers who had depended on his transportation for years suddenly found other arrangements. When Thomas inquired about the change, he was met with vague excuses and averted eyes. Mrs. Adelaide Porter, the elderly shopkeeper who had always treated him with kindness, pulled him aside one afternoon as he was purchasing nails and hinges for the boarding house project. "Thomas," she said in a voice carefully lowered to avoid eavesdropping ears, "I feel I should warn you. There's talk in town about you and Mrs. Brennan." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. What kind of talk? Mrs. Porter glanced around nervously before continuing. "Folks are saying it's not proper, a single man spending so much time at a widow's place. Victor Caldwell's been particularly vocal about it, suggesting that your motivations aren't entirely charitable." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had known that small towns thrived on gossip, but he had underestimated the speed with which innocent actions could be twisted into something sordid. "Mrs. Brennan's brother-in-law is there every day," he said carefully. "The children are always present. There's nothing improper about helping neighbors." "I know that," Mrs. Porter replied gently, "and anyone with sense can see the good you're doing. But sense isn't always what drives people's opinions. I'm telling you this as a friend because I fear things may get more difficult before they get better." That evening, as Thomas worked alone in his cabin, tallying accounts and planning the next day's tasks, he found himself wrestling with doubts that had nothing to do with construction techniques or material costs. He had lived his adult life carefully, avoiding entanglements that might compromise his independence or reputation. The freight business required trust, and trust could be easily damaged by whispered suspicions and malicious rumors. He could walk away. The boarding house frame was solid, and James was learning quickly enough to handle the remaining work with minimal help. Thomas could return to his solitary existence, his well-ordered life of schedules and contracts and relationships that never ventured beyond the professional. But even as he considered the practical advantages of withdrawal, Thomas found himself thinking about Kate's laugh when Samuel had attempted to hammer a nail and hit his thumb instead. He remembered the way she had listened to his story about the blizzard that had nearly cost him a team of oxen, her green eyes bright with interest and concern. He thought about the quiet pride in her voice when she described her plans for the boarding house's future, the determination that had carried her through loss and was now rebuilding hope from ashes. The next morning brought the first frost of the season, coating the world in delicate crystal that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Thomas loaded his wagon with the day's materials and made his way to Cedar Street, arriving to find Kate already at work, her breath visible in the crisp air as she sorted through a delivery of window glass. She looked up at his approach, and Thomas caught something different in her expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. James was nowhere to be seen, and when Thomas asked about him, Kate's answer was carefully neutral. "He's taken the children to visit friends in Pine Ridge for a few days. Thought they could use a change of scenery after all the disruption." Thomas nodded, but he sensed there was more to the story. The timing was convenient, removing James and the children just as the town's gossip was reaching a crescendo. It suggested that Kate, too, was feeling the pressure of public opinion. They worked in relative silence that morning, the easy conversation of previous days replaced by a politeness that felt forced and uncomfortable. Thomas found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, every moment when their hands might accidentally touch as they reached for the same tool, every casual comment that might be misconstrued by watching eyes. Because there were watching eyes. Thomas noticed them throughout the morning, faces peering from windows, figures finding reasons to walk past the construction site, the kinds of lingering glances that made him feel like an actor in a play where he didn't know his lines. Around midday, Reverend Jonathan Mills appeared, his black coat and serious demeanor announcing his purpose before he spoke a word. Mills was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of stern countenance that seemed perpetually prepared for disapproval. He had ministered to Millbrook's spiritual needs for over a decade, and his opinions carried considerable weight in the community. "Mrs. Brennan," he said formally, removing his hat with precise courtesy. "Mr. Hayes, I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I felt it necessary to speak with you both." Kate set down the piece of trim she had been measuring, her face composed but alert. "Of course, Reverend. How can we help you?" Mills cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his mission, but determined to see it through. "I've been hearing concerns from members of my congregation about the nature of this project, about the propriety of the arrangements here." Thomas felt heat rise in his chest, but Kate responded before he could speak. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, Reverend. We're rebuilding a family home with the help of a generous neighbor. Where is the impropriety in that?" "The impropriety," Mills replied carefully, lies in the appearance of the situation. A single man and a widow spending long hours together without adequate supervision. It creates an impression that reflects poorly on both of your reputations. Kate's green eyes flashed with something dangerous. Are you suggesting that I'm incapable of conducting myself with appropriate decorum, or that Thomas has behaved in any way that isn't entirely honorable? I'm suggesting, Mills said, his voice taking on the tone he used for sermons about moral rectitude, that even the appearance of impropriety can be damaging to the community's moral fabric. Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, as the saying goes. Thomas stepped forward, his considerable size casting a shadow over the smaller man. Reverend, with respect, Mrs. Brennan's reputation is spotless, and anyone who suggests otherwise is speaking from ignorance or malice. As for my own behavior, I'll stand by it against any man's judgment. Mills looked up at him with the expression of someone who had bitten into something unexpectedly bitter. I'm not questioning your personal integrity, Mr. Hayes. I'm simply pointing out that in a community like ours, perceptions matter as much as reality. People are talking, and talk has a way of taking on a life of its own. Kate moved to stand beside Thomas, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of lavender soap that she used. Then perhaps, Reverend, you should be counseling your congregation about the sin of bearing false witness, rather than asking honest people to accommodate malicious gossip. The rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that Mills actually took a step backward. Mrs. Brennan, I understand that you're under considerable stress, but surely you can see the wisdom in avoiding even the appearance of scandal. Perhaps if Mr. Hayes were to limit his involvement in the project, or if additional supervision could be arranged. No. The word came from Thomas with such finality that both Kate and Mills turned to stare at him. I gave my word that I'd help see this project through, and I don't break my word for gossip or threats or moral posturing. Mills's face flushed red above his clerical collar. Mr. Hayes, I hardly think that pointing out legitimate concerns constitutes moral posturing. And I hardly think that helping a neighbor rebuild after a tragedy constitutes grounds for community condemnation, Thomas replied evenly. But then, I've always believed that actions speak louder than words, and that a man's character is measured by what he does when it's difficult, not when it's easy. The implied criticism of Mill's courage in facing down the gossipers was not lost on the Reverend. He replaced his hat with sharp, angry movements. Very well, I've done my duty in bringing these concerns to your attention. I can only hope that you'll both consider the broader implications of your choices. As Mills walked away, his back rigid with offended dignity, Thomas felt Kate's hand touch his arm briefly. It was a gesture of gratitude and solidarity, but also something more complex, an acknowledgement that they had just crossed a line together. Thank you, she said quietly, for standing with me. Always, Thomas replied, and meant it with a completeness that surprised him. But even as they returned to work, both were aware that the confrontation had changed something fundamental in their situation. They were no longer simply neighbors helping each other through a difficult time. They had become allies in a conflict that neither had sought, but both were now committed to fighting. That afternoon brought new challenges in the form of delayed material deliveries and sudden price increases from suppliers who had previously dealt fairly with Thomas. It was becoming clear that the pressure was not limited to social disapproval. It was extending into the economic realm where Thomas's livelihood depended on community goodwill. Kate noticed his growing frustration, though he tried to hide it behind his usual stoic demeanor. It's getting worse, isn't it? She asked during a break when they sat on the partially completed porch, sharing coffee from a thermos she had brought. Thomas considered deflecting the question, but something in her direct gaze discouraged dishonesty. Some, he admitted. Business has been slower lately, people finding other ways to move their freight. Kate was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the street where ordinary life continued, despite the drama playing out in their small corner of the world. I could stop the project, she said finally. Tell people that I've decided not to rebuild after all. That might take the pressure off. No. Thomas's response was immediate and vehement. That would be letting them win, letting them dictate how decent people live their lives. Besides, he added more gently, this isn't just about the boarding house anymore. It's about whether people have the right to help each other without asking. Permission from busybodies and bullies. Kate turned to study his profile, noting the stubborn set of his jaw and the determination in his eyes. You could lose everything you've built here. Your business, your reputation, your place in the community. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Some things are worth more than business success or social approval. My father used to say that a man's word is all he truly owns, and everything else is just borrowed. I gave my word to help you rebuild, and I intend to keep it. The conviction in his voice sent warmth spreading through Kate's chest, though she tried to ignore the implications of her emotional response. She had not expected to feel anything beyond gratitude toward the man who had saved her family and offered to help with reconstruction. But somewhere in the weeks of shared labor and conversation, something deeper had taken root. What if I asked you to reconsider, she said carefully, not to quit, but to step back until the gossip dies down. Let James and me finish the work. Thomas was quiet for so long that Kate wondered if she had offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her look at him more carefully. Is that what you want, for me to step back? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Kate found herself thinking about the past weeks, about the pleasure she had discovered in sharing the day's work with someone who understood, both its importance and its challenges. She thought about Thomas's quiet competence, his gentle patience with the children, his way of listening to her ideas as if they mattered. No, she said softly. It's not what I want, but I don't want you to suffer for helping me. Thomas smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all day. Kate, he said, using her given name with the same careful deliberation she had used with his. I've been suffering for years without even knowing it. Working alongside you, building something meaningful instead of just moving other people's possessions from place to place. That's not suffering. That's the closest thing to happiness I've known in longer than I care to admit. The admission hung in the air between them, changing the nature of their conversation in ways that both recognized, but neither was quite prepared to explore. They sat in silence for a while, watching the autumn lights slant across the construction site, aware that they had just acknowledged something that would make retreat more difficult and advance more dangerous. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they secured the tools and covered the materials for another night. But as Thomas prepared to leave, Kate called his name softly. Thomas, she said, and he heard something in her voice that made him turn back to face her fully. Whatever comes next, I want you to know that these weeks have meant more to me than just getting my home rebuilt. You've reminded me that there are still good men in the world, men who keep their word even when it costs them. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of defenses that had been in place for so long he had forgotten they were there. Kate, he said, stepping closer, you've reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving from one day to the next. That's a gift I never expected to receive. They stood facing each other in the gathering dusk, two people who had found something precious and unexpected in the midst of ordinary kindness. Neither spoke of love, It was too soon for such words, too dangerous given their circumstances. But both recognized that what had grown between them during these weeks of shared labor was something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything they had built separately. As Thomas drove home through the star-filled darkness, he found himself thinking about courage and the different forms it could take. There was the courage he had shown in the fire, the physical bravery that had saved lives and property. But there was also this quieter courage, the willingness to build something beautiful in the face of opposition, to choose hope over safety, to believe that love could grow even in the hardest ground. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, Thomas Hayes allowed himself to believe that some things were worth any price, and that the woman with green eyes and calloused hands might just be brave enough to believe it too. Winter's first serious storm arrived with the fury of a wounded animal, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and turning the half-finished boarding house into a ghostly outline, barely visible through the swirling white. Thomas fought his way through the blizzard to check on the construction, his concern for the exposed framework overriding his usual caution about weather travel. He found Kate in the skeletal structure, securing loose materials and covering vulnerable joints with oiled canvas. Her cheeks were bright red from the cold, and ice crystals had formed on her eyelashes. But her movements were methodical and efficient. She looked up at his approach with relief and something warmer. "I was hoping you'd come," she called over the wind's howl. "I'm worried about the northeast wall. The wind keeps catching those loose boards." Together, they worked to reinforce the vulnerable sections, their hands sometimes touching as they reached for the same rope or board. Even through their heavy gloves, Thomas was aware of the contact, the way her presence seemed to generate its own warmth against the storm's bite. When they had done all they could to protect the construction, Kate led him to the small shed they had built for storing tools and materials. Inside, out of the wind's reach, she had set up a small camp stove and was brewing coffee in a battered pot. "James took the children to his sister's place in Denver last week," she explained as she poured the steaming liquid into tin cups. "He wanted them away from the worst of the gossip, and I thought it might be safer if they weren't here when winter really set in." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm metal. "Safer from the weather, or safer from the talk?" Kate met his gaze directly. "Both, if I'm honest." "The talk has gotten uglier, Thomas. Victor Caldwell's been spreading stories that go beyond mere impropriety. He's suggesting that we're taking advantage of the community's goodwill, that the fire might not have been entirely accidental." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The implication that Kate might have deliberately set fire to her own home, endangering her family for some imagined financial gain, was so vicious it left him momentarily speechless. "That's pure malice," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "No one who knows you would believe such a thing." "Unfortunately," Kate replied wearily, "not everyone who's talking knows me well, and Caldwell has influence with people who matter. The bank, the town council, the territorial authorities. He's been asking questions about the insurance money, suggesting that the investigation was inadequate." Thomas set down his coffee cup with careful precision, fighting the urge to find Caldwell immediately and settle the matter in the direct way his frontier upbringing suggested. "What does the sheriff say?" "Sheriff Morrison is a fair man, but he's also practical. He can't ignore the pressure if enough influential people demand action. Caldwell's been pushing for a formal inquiry into the fire's cause and our subsequent actions." The shed fell silent, except for the wind's continuous assault on its walls. Thomas stared into his coffee, processing the implications of what Kate had told him. A formal inquiry would mean scrutiny of every aspect of their relationship, every moment they had spent together, every gesture of kindness that could be twisted into something sinister. "I should go," he said finally. "Withdraw from the project, let you finish the work with hired help. Remove myself as a target for their accusations." Kate's response was immediate and fierce. Don't you dare let them drive you away with lies and innuendo." "Kate, if my presence here is making things worse for you—" "Your presence here is the only thing keeping me sane," she interrupted, then seemed surprised by her own vehemence. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so forceful, but Thomas, if you leave now, it validates everything they're saying. It makes us look guilty of something we haven't done." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, noting the determined set of her jaw and the fire in her green eyes. Here was a woman who had faced the destruction of her home and livelihood without flinching, who had buried a husband and taken responsibility for his brother's family without complaint. If she was willing to fight this battle, who was he to suggest retreat? "Then we see it through," he said quietly. "Whatever comes." Kate's smile was radiant enough to warm the drafty shed. "Whatever comes," she agreed. But even as they made their pact, both were aware that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one gathering around them in the community. That awareness proved prophetic when, 3 days later, Sheriff Morrison appeared at the construction site with a grim expression and an official-looking document in his hand. Morrison was a lean man in his 40s, with grey-streaked hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with frontier justice. He had always been fair in his dealings with Thomas, but today he wore the careful neutrality of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Thomas, Kate," he said with formal politeness, "I'm afraid I need to speak with you both about some serious allegations that have been brought to my attention." Kate straightened, wiping her hands on her work apron. "What kind of allegations, Sheriff?" Morrison unfolded the document he carried. "There's been a formal complaint filed by Victor Caldwell and supported by several prominent citizens alleging fraud in connection with the insurance settlement from your fire and improper conduct that may constitute a breach of public morals. I'm required to conduct a formal investigation." The words hung in the frigid air like icicles waiting to fall. Kate felt the blood drain from her face, while Thomas's hands slowly clenched into fists at his sides. The accusation was even worse than they had feared, striking not just at their reputations, but at Kate's very livelihood and freedom. "On what grounds?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Morrison consulted his papers reluctantly. "The complaint alleges that Mrs. Brennan may have deliberately set the fire to collect insurance money, and that you, Mr. Hayes, have been complicit in helping her establish a false narrative of heroic rescue. It further suggests that your continued involvement in the reconstruction is evidence of an improper relationship that violates community standards." Kate's laugh was bitter and sharp. "So, according to Victor Caldwell, I burned down my own home, endangering my family, just to collect insurance money I didn't even have. And Thomas risked his life in an elaborate charade to help me commit fraud." "I'm not saying the allegations have merit," Morrison replied carefully, "but they've been made formally, with signatures from 12 prominent citizens, and I'm legally obligated to investigate. I'll need to examine the insurance records, interview witnesses to the fire, and look into the nature of your relationship with Mr. Hayes." Thomas stepped closer to Kate, his presence solid and protective. "Sheriff, you know me. You know, I've never been involved in anything dishonest in all my years of doing business in this territory. Are you really going to let Caldwell's vendetta against Mrs. Brennan drag both our reputations through the mud?" Morrison's expression showed his discomfort with the situation. "Thomas, I've got no personal quarrel with either of you, but the law's the law, and when formal complaints are filed, they have to be investigated. I'm hoping we can clear this up quickly and quietly, but until then, I'm going to have to ask you to suspend work on this project. No. Kate's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. I will not suspend work on rebuilding my home because of malicious lies. If you want to investigate, Sheriff, then investigate, but I won't let Caldwell's intimidation tactics succeed. Morrison sighed heavily, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Mrs. Brennan, I understand your frustration, but continued work while under investigation could be seen as obstruction. I'm asking you both to cooperate with the process. And I'm telling you that stopping work would be seen as admission of guilt, Kate replied firmly. If Caldwell wants to destroy my reputation, he'll have to do it while I continue to live my life with dignity and purpose. Thomas admired her courage, even as he worried about the consequences of defying official pressure. What exactly does your investigation require, Sheriff? Are we under arrest? No arrests at this time, Morrison replied. But I'll need to search the property for evidence related to the fire's origin, examine financial records, and conduct interviews with relevant parties. I'm hoping to complete the investigation within a week, assuming I receive full cooperation. Kate nodded curtly. You'll have my cooperation, Sheriff, but not my submission to intimidation. The insurance company already investigated the fire thoroughly and paid out the claim. The fire marshal's report is on file. If Caldwell has new evidence of wrongdoing, let him present it. Otherwise, this is nothing more than harassment. As Morrison departed with promises to conduct a fair and thorough investigation, Kate and Thomas found themselves facing the reality of public scrutiny that would examine every aspect of their relationship. The half-finished boarding house stood around them like the skeleton of their shared hopes, exposed to the harsh light of official suspicion. They'll tear apart everything we've built here, Kate said quietly, looking around at the walls that represented so much more than mere construction. Every board, every nail, every moment we've shared will be examined for evidence of impropriety. Thomas moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to provide ammunition for their accusers. Let them look. They'll find nothing but honest work and honest intentions. Will they? Kate asked, turning to face him fully. Because if I'm honest, Thomas, what's grown between us isn't just about rebuilding a boarding house. It's not just about neighborly assistance or charitable impulses. There's something more here, something that started the day you pulled my family from that fire and has been growing stronger ever since. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross until now. Thomas felt his carefully, maintained emotional distance crumbling under the weight of her honesty. Kate, he said softly, I won't lie to you or to myself anymore. What I feel for you goes beyond friendship or simple attraction. You've become essential to me in ways I never thought possible. But acknowledging that now, under these circumstances, could destroy us both. Kate stepped closer, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. Or it could save us. Thomas, if we're going to face this investigation, this trial by public opinion, shouldn't we at least be honest about what we're fighting for? Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. A group of riders was making its way up the street, their faces grim with purpose. At their head rode Victor Caldwell, but he was not alone. Reverend Mills was there, along with several prominent businessmen and landowners. This was no casual visit. This was a delegation with authority and intent. Caldwell dismounted with theatrical flourish, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as a man who valued appearance over substance. His pale eyes swept over the construction site with undisguised satisfaction, as if he were already calculating the profit from its eventual sale. Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Hayes, he said with false courtesy, I trust Sheriff Morrison has informed you of the serious allegations that have been brought to the community's attention. Kate straightened to her full height, which brought her nearly to Caldwell's eye level. He has, and I've told him what I'll tell you. These allegations are baseless attacks on honest people trying to rebuild after a tragedy. Are they? Caldwell's smile was sharp as a winter wind. Because the evidence suggests a pattern of deception that goes to the very heart of this community's trust. Reverend Mills cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Brennan, surely you can understand the community's concern. The appearance of impropriety, even if unintended, can be damaging to the moral fabric that holds us together. Thomas stepped forward, his considerable size casting a shadow over the smaller man. Reverend, the only thing damaging the moral fabric of this community is the willingness to destroy good people's reputations based on gossip and spite. Good people, Caldwell interjected smoothly, don't find themselves the subject of formal investigations. Good people don't conduct their affairs in ways that require such scrutiny. Kate's temper, held in check through weeks of increasing pressure, finally snapped. Victor Caldwell, you've been trying to acquire this property since before my husband died. You've made offers that insulted our intelligence and threatened consequences when we refused to sell. Now you're using this community's trust to pursue a personal vendetta, and you have the audacity to lecture us about moral conduct. Caldwell's mask of civility slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. I've made legitimate business offers for property that frankly is too valuable to be wasted on a struggling boarding house operation. But that's neither here nor there. What matters now is that this investigation will determine the truth about your fire and your subsequent actions. And what if the investigation finds no evidence of wrongdoing? Thomas asked, his voice deceptively calm. Then you'll be cleared of criminal charges, Caldwell replied with a shrug. But the damage to your reputations will already be done. People don't forget these kinds of allegations, even when they're not proven. It might be wise to consider cutting your losses now, while you still have some dignity left. The threat was delivered with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and social pressure. But he had misjudged his targets. Kate and Thomas had both survived too much to be cowed by a bully in expensive clothes. Mr. Caldwell, Kate said with icy politeness, I suggest you focus your energy on whatever evidence you claim to have, because you're going to need more than innuendo and social pressure to prove your accusations. And when this investigation clears us as it will, you'll find that some reputations are harder to destroy than others. Caldwell's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, one of his companions leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. The man's expression changed, and he cast a nervous glance toward the end of the street. Sheriff Morrison was returning, but he was not alone. Riding beside him was a tall, distinguished man in a well-cut traveling coat. Even from a distance, there was something in the stranger's bearing that suggested authority and purpose. Who is that? Mills asked nervously, shading his eyes against the afternoon glare. Morrison and his companion reined their horses to a stop near the group, and the sheriff's expression was carefully neutral. Folks, I'd like you to meet Deputy Territorial Marshal James Crawford. He's here on official business related to the investigation. Crawford dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to travel and quickly assessed the assembled group with sharp, intelligent eyes. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threads in his dark hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of dealing with frontier justice. Marshal, Caldwell said with forced joviality, I assume Sheriff Morrison has briefed you on the serious allegations that have brought us together today. Crawford's gaze settled on Caldwell with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. He has. And I've also had the opportunity to review some additional evidence that wasn't included in your original complaint. The statement sent a ripple of unease through Caldwell's supporters. Mills cleared his throat nervously. "What kind of additional evidence, Marshal?" Crawford reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "Evidence that suggests these allegations may themselves constitute a criminal conspiracy to defraud Mrs. Brennan of her property and damage the reputations of innocent citizens." The blood drained from Caldwell's face. "That's preposterous. We're concerned citizens exercising our civic duty to report suspicious behavior." "Are you?" Crawford opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. "Because the Territorial Insurance Commission has some interesting information about previous fire claims in communities where you've conducted business, Mr. Caldwell. Claims that were later found to be fraudulent, filed by individuals who subsequently sold their property to you at well below market value." Caldwell's composure cracked visibly. "I resent the implication that my business dealings have been anything other than legitimate." "I'm sure you do," Crawford replied mildly. "But the pattern is quite clear once you know what to look for. Communities where you've sought to acquire prime real estate, followed by mysterious fires, followed by insurance investigations that create enough doubt to force desperate property owners to sell cheap." Kate felt a surge of vindication mixed with outrage. "You've done this before. This isn't about morality or community standards. It's about stealing people's property through manufactured scandals." Crawford nodded grimly. "The territorial government has been tracking a series of similar incidents across Colorado and Wyoming. Property fraud disguised as moral crusades, using the power of community pressure to achieve what couldn't be accomplished through legal means." Reverend Mills looked genuinely shocked. "Marshal, surely you're not suggesting that our concerns about moral conduct are part of some criminal conspiracy?" "I'm suggesting, Reverend, that you've been manipulated by a man who understands how to exploit good people's genuine desire to maintain community standards, Mr. Caldwell. Here is very skilled at finding upstanding citizens who can be convinced to lend their names and reputations to his schemes." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a barely contained fire. Several of Caldwell's supporters were already backing away, their faces showing the dawning realization that they had been used as pawns in a game they didn't understand. Caldwell himself seemed to age years in the span of minutes. The confident predator had been replaced by a cornered animal, dangerous in his desperation. "This is all circumstantial nonsense," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You can't prove any connection between my legitimate business interests and these unfounded allegations." "Can't I?" Crawford withdrew another document from his portfolio. "This is a sworn statement from your former business partner in Wyoming, detailing your methods for acquiring distressed properties. It makes for fascinating reading." Thomas felt Kate's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but steady. Together they watched as Caldwell's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of official scrutiny. The man who had terrorized them with threats and innuendo was revealed as nothing more than a sophisticated thief, using the community's trust to line his own pockets. "Marshal Crawford," Kate said formally, "what happens now?" Crawford's expression softened as he looked at her. "Now, Mrs. Brennan, you and Mr. Hayes are cleared of all suspicion. The fire investigation is closed, your insurance claim is validated, and you're free to complete your reconstruction without interference." "And Caldwell?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Caldwell will be returning to Denver with me to face federal charges related to mail fraud and conspiracy. The territorial court will determine his fate." Crawford's gaze swept over the remaining members of Caldwell's group. "As for the rest of you gentlemen, I suggest you consider more carefully who you trust with your community's reputation in the future. As the marshal led Caldwell away in handcuffs, the other men dispersed quickly, eager to distance themselves from the scandal they had unwittingly supported. Within minutes, Kate and Thomas found themselves alone again on the construction site. The afternoon sun slanting across walls that no longer felt like symbols of defiance, but promises of hope fulfilled. "It's over," Kate said softly, though she seemed almost afraid to believe it. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "This part is over. But Kate, we still need to talk about what comes next, about what we acknowledged to each other before all this started." Kate turned to face him fully, her green eyes bright with tears of relief and something deeper. "You're right, we do need to talk about that. Because, Thomas, I meant what I said. What I feel for you isn't just gratitude or friendship, it's love. Real and deep and frightening in its intensity." Thomas felt the last of his emotional barriers crumble under the honesty in her voice. "I love you too, Kate. I think I have since the moment I saw you refuse to leave that burning building until everyone was safe. Your courage, your strength, your determination to protect the people you care about. It's everything I've ever wanted in a partner, and everything I thought I'd never find." They stood together in the skeleton of the boarding house they had, built with their own hands, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor and shared dreams. The investigation was over, the accusations proven false, the community's trust restored. But more than that, they had found something precious in the midst of adversity, something that had been tested by fire and proven strong enough to last. As the sun began to set, painting the construction site in shades of gold and amber, Kate and Thomas made their plans for the future. The boarding house would be completed, but it would be more than a business venture. It would be a home, a place, where two people who had found each other against all odds could build a life together based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love deep enough to weather any storm. The town of Millbrook would remember this day as the moment when justice prevailed over corruption, when truth defeated lies, when good people stood together against those who would exploit their trust. But for Kate and Thomas, it would be remembered as the day they stopped fighting the world and started building their future together, one board, one nail, one shared dream at a time. Part 4. The Heart's Foundation. Spring arrived in Millbrook with the gentle persistence of hope itself, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing the first tender shoots of grass from the winter-hardened earth. The completed boarding house stood proudly on Cedar Street, its fresh-painted walls gleaming white in the morning sun, blue shutters framing windows that sparkled with cleanliness and promise. A hand-carved sign hung beside the front door. Brennan House, lodging, for travelers and extended stays. Thomas adjusted his tie for the third time, catching his reflection in the hall mirror and wondering how a man who had spent most of his adult life in work clothes and dust had come to be standing in his best suit, preparing for the most important conversation of his life. 6 months had passed since Marshal Crawford had exposed Victor Caldwell's scheme and cleared their names. 6 months of working side by side to complete the boarding house while carefully navigating the growing intimacy between them. They had been circumspect in their courtship, conscious of the community's scrutiny, even after their vindication. Thomas had continued to maintain his own cabin, visiting the boarding house during daylight hours and always in the presence of James and the children, who had returned from Denver with stories of the big city and eager questions about the rebuilt home. But despite their caution, or perhaps because of it, their relationship had deepened with the slow, sure progress of a foundation properly laid. Kate emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of fresh-baked biscuits and wearing a dress of soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She had pinned her hair up in an elaborate style that Thomas had never seen before, and the effect was so striking that he momentarily forgot why he had come early this morning. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and was rewarded with a smile that made his chest tighten with feelings he was still learning to trust. "Thank you," Kate replied, setting the tray on the dining room table where they had shared so many meals over the past months. "I wanted everything to be perfect today. James is bringing the children back from their weekend with Mrs. Porter, and I thought we could all have breakfast together before you make your announcement." Thomas nodded, though his palms were damp with nervousness despite his outward calm. The announcement Kate referred to was his intention to formally ask for her hand in marriage, a declaration that would make official what everyone in town already assumed to be true. The ring in his vest pocket seemed to weigh more than his freight wagon, a simple band of gold set with a small but clear diamond that had belonged to his mother. "Are you nervous?" Kate asked gently, moving closer and straightening his already perfect tie with hands that trembled slightly. "Terrified," Thomas admitted with a rueful smile. "I've faced down blizzards and bandits, but the thought of asking you to marry me has me shaking like a schoolboy." Kate's laugh was soft and musical. "You don't need to be nervous, Thomas. You must know by now what my answer will be." "I hope I do," Thomas replied, capturing her hands in his. "But hoping and knowing are different things, and this is too important to assume anything." Before Kate could respond, the sound of approaching voices announced the arrival of James and the children. Lucy burst through the front door with the boundless energy of childhood, her auburn hair flying behind her as she raced to embrace her aunt. Samuel followed more sedately, but his grin was equally bright as he wrapped his arms around Kate's waist. "Aunt Kate!" Lucy exclaimed. "Mrs. Porter taught me how to make jam, and she said I could help you make some for the boarding house guests." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Kate replied, smoothing the girl's hair. "We'll start a garden this spring and grow our own strawberries." James appeared in the doorway, carrying a small satchel and wearing the contented expression of a man who had found his place in the world. The month since the fire had been good to him. His injuries had healed completely, and he had found steady work with the railroad survey crew that was planning a new line through the territory. More importantly, he had begun courting Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, and their obvious happiness together had provided a positive example for the children of love rebuilt after loss. "Morning, Kate Thomas," James said warmly. "Something smells incredible in here." "Breakfast will be ready in just a few minutes," Kate replied. "Thomas has something he'd like to discuss with all of us." The words sent another spike of nervousness through Thomas's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was his chosen family now, these people who had welcomed him into their lives and hearts. If he was going to propose to Kate, it was only right that he include them in the moment. They gathered around the dining table, the same table where Thomas had shared countless meals over the past months, where he had helped Lucy with her letters and listened to Samuel's elaborate stories about his imaginary adventures. The morning light streamed through the lace curtains Kate had sewn herself, casting dancing patterns on the polished wood surface. "Before we eat," Thomas began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "I have something important to say to all of you." Lucy looked up from arranging her napkin, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you going away again, Mr. Thomas? Because Papa James says you don't take as many freight jobs anymore." Thomas smiled at her directness. "No, sweetheart. Actually, I'm hoping to stay closer to home from now on. Much closer." He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and turned to face Kate. Her green eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and promise. "Catherine Brennan," Thomas said formally, reaching into his vest pocket for the ring. "You saved my life the day you let me help rebuild this house. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean being alone, that courage can be found in kindness as much as conflict. You've given me a family, a home, a purpose beyond mere survival." He dropped to one knee beside her chair, holding the ring, where the morning light caught the diamond's facets and scattered tiny rainbows across the table. "Will you marry me, Kate? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the love you've shown me?" Kate's tears spilled over as she looked down at the man who had become everything she had never dared to hope for. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Thomas Hayes, I will marry you." The room erupted in celebration as Lucy clapped her hands and Samuel whooped with delight. James grinned broadly and reached across to shake Thomas's hand as he slipped the ring onto Kate's finger. The simple band fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time to find its proper home. "When will you get married?" Lucy asked, excitedly. "Can I help plan the wedding? Can I wear a fancy dress?" Kate laughed, wiping tears from her cheeks. "We'll need to discuss the details, but I think a summer wedding would be lovely. And yes, you can certainly help plan it and wear the fanciest dress we can find." "Will you live here with us?" Samuel asked Thomas, his young face serious with concern. "Or will Aunt Kate have to move away?" Thomas reached over to ruffle the boy's hair. "I'll be moving in here, if that's all right with you. This house has become more of a home to me than anywhere I've ever lived." The breakfast that followed was a celebration in every sense, filled with laughter and plans and the kind of easy conversation that marked a family comfortable with itself. Kate had outdone herself with the meal, and Thomas found himself marveling once again at her ability to create warmth and welcome from the simplest ingredients. As they lingered over coffee and Kate's famous apple preserves, James cleared his throat diplomatically. "Thomas, I hope you know that Kate's happiness is the most important thing to me. She's been like a mother to my children since their own mother passed, and she deserves every joy life can offer." Thomas met the other man's gaze steadily. "I know, James, and I promise you that I'll spend every day trying to deserve the gift she's giving me." "I know you will," James replied with a smile. Anyone who was willing to risk everything to defend her honor against Caldwell's lies has already proven his character. The mention of their former adversary cast a momentary shadow over the celebration, but it was quickly dispelled by the children's excited chatter about wedding plans. Caldwell had been convicted and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, his property schemes exposed and his victims compensated. More importantly for Millbrook, his downfall had served as a warning to other potential predators that the community would not tolerate exploitation disguised as moral concern. As the morning progressed into afternoon, friends and neighbors began arriving to offer their congratulations. Mrs. Porter brought a bottle of her finest elderberry wine, declaring that she had been expecting this announcement for months. Reverend Mills, properly chastened by his role in Caldwell's scheme, offered his services for the wedding ceremony and a heartfelt apology for his earlier suspicions. Even Sheriff Morrison stopped by, expressing his pleasure at the engagement and admitting that he had never really believed the accusations against them. "Good people deserve good things," he said simply, shaking Thomas's hand, "and you two are some of the best people I know." By evening, the boarding house was filled with well-wishers and the sound of celebration. Kate moved among her guests, with graceful ease, playing the perfect hostess while never straying far from Thomas's side. He found himself watching her with wonder, still amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. As the last guests departed and the children were tucked into their beds, Kate and Thomas found themselves alone on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was warm with the promise of summer, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. "Happy?" Thomas asked, slipping his arm around Kate's waist and pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Kate replied, leaning into his embrace. "Thomas, do you think we're rushing things? It's only been a year since my husband died, and people might think—" "People will always find something to think," Thomas interrupted gently. But the people who matter know that love doesn't follow schedules or social conventions. If you're ready, if this feels right to you, then we're not rushing anything. Kate turned in his arms to face him fully. It does feel right. It feels like coming home after a very long journey through unfamiliar territory. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other through circumstances that could have destroyed them both. The boarding house behind them represented more than a business venture or a rebuilt home. It was a testament to the power of human resilience and the miracle of second chances. "I love you, Kate Brennan," Thomas said softly, his lips brushing against her hair. "I love you too, Thomas Hayes," she replied, "and I can't wait to become Kate Hayes and start our life together officially." As they made their way inside, turning off the lamps and securing the doors for the night, both were thinking about the future they would build together. There would be challenges, certainly. The everyday difficulties of running a business and raising children and navigating the complexities of marriage. But they had already proven that they could face adversity together, that their combined strength was greater than the sum of their individual parts. The boarding house settled around them with the contented creaks and sighs of a structure that had found its purpose. In a few months, it would welcome its first paying guests, travelers seeking shelter and comfort in the growing town of Millbrook. But tonight, it sheltered something more precious than mere lodgers. A family knit together by choice rather than blood, by love tested in fire and proven strong enough to last. Thomas paused at the foot of the stairs, looking around at the home. He would soon officially share. Every board, every nail, every carefully crafted detail bore the mark of their shared labor and shared dreams. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, more than he had believed possible when he was a solitary man moving freight across empty landscapes. "Thank you," he said quietly to Kate, who stood waiting on the first step. "For what?" She asked, puzzled. "For seeing something in me worth saving, for believing that a rough man with calloused hands could learn to be gentle, for giving me a family and a home and a future I never thought I deserved." Kate smiled, her eyes bright, with love and promise. "Thomas Hayes, you saved us first. From the fire, from poverty, from the loneliness that comes from facing the world alone. We saved each other, and that's the best foundation any marriage could have." As they made their way upstairs to their separate rooms, both carrying the glow of new engagement and the anticipation of their coming wedding, the boarding house seemed to embrace them with the warmth of true belonging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight they rested in the security of love acknowledged and promise made. The future stretched before them like an open road, full of possibility and adventure, and the quiet satisfaction that came from building something lasting together. They had begun as strangers, thrown together by tragedy, but they had become partners in the truest sense, ready to face whatever lay ahead, with confidence born of tested love and proven trust. August arrived in Millbrook with a blaze of golden sunshine and the sweet scent of wildflowers blooming across the surrounding meadows. The town had dressed itself for celebration, with colorful bunting strung between the buildings and every window box overflowing with bright blossoms. Today was the day that Catherine Brennan would become Catherine Hayes, and the entire community had turned out to witness the union that had grown from tragedy into triumph. The morning found Kate in her room at the boarding house, surrounded by a flutter of women helping her prepare for the ceremony. Sarah Mitchell, now James's fiancée and the town's beloved schoolteacher, carefully arranged the delicate lace veil that had belonged to Kate's mother. Mrs. Porter fussed over the details of Kate's dress, a creation of ivory silk that had been her own wedding gown, carefully altered to fit Kate's slender frame. "You look absolutely radiant, dear," Mrs. Porter declared, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Thomas is going to be speechless when he sees you." Kate smiled nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the small bouquet of wild roses and baby's breath that Lucy had helped her gather that morning. "I hope I don't trip walking down the aisle. I feel like my knees might give out at any moment." "That's perfectly normal," Sarah assured her with a gentle laugh. "I felt the same way at my first wedding, but the moment you see Thomas waiting for you, all the nervousness will disappear. Love has a way of making everything else fade into the background." Through the open window came the sound of carriages arriving and voices calling greetings to one another. The entire town seemed to be gathering in the church courtyard, and Kate felt a surge of gratitude for the community that had initially questioned her relationship with Thomas, but had come to embrace their love story as one of hope and redemption. Lucy burst into the room, her own dress of pale yellow silk making her look like a small sunbeam. "Aunt Kate, Papa James says it's almost time, and Mr. Thomas looks so handsome in his new suit that Mrs. Henderson said she might faint." Kate laughed, despite her nerves. "Well, we can't have Mrs. Henderson fainting during the ceremony. Is everyone ready?" "Uncle Samuel is with the rings," Lucy reported importantly, "and Papa James is waiting downstairs to walk you to the church. He practiced his speech 3 times this morning and only stumbled twice." The mention of James walking her down the aisle brought tears to Kate's eyes. When she had asked him to give her away, he had been so moved that he had been unable to speak for several minutes. It seemed fitting that the man who had become like a brother to her should be the one to entrust her future to Thomas's care. A soft knock at the door announced James's arrival. He entered wearing his finest suit, his hair carefully combed, and his face glowing with pride and happiness. "Kate," he said softly, "you look beautiful. Michael would be so happy to see you. Like this, so radiant and full of joy." The mention of her late husband brought a bittersweet smile to Kate's face. She had wondered if she would feel guilty on her wedding day, as if she were somehow betraying Michael's memory. But instead, she felt only gratitude for the love he had given her and the strength it had provided to open her heart again. "I think he would like Thomas," she said quietly. "They're different men, but they share the same fundamental decency, the same willingness to put others before themselves." James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Michael always said that love shouldn't be hoarded like gold. He wanted you to be happy, Kate, and I know he would approve of the man you've chosen." The church bells began to ring, their melodious call floating across the town and summoning the community to witness the marriage. Kate took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts one final time, and allowed James to escort her downstairs and out into the brilliant August afternoon. The short walk to the church took them through streets lined with well-wishers. Children threw flower petals from their mothers' gardens, and elderly women dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Even the men, usually uncomfortable with displays of sentiment, smiled broadly and called out good wishes for the bride. At the church steps, Kate paused to look back at the boarding house that had brought her and Thomas together. It stood proud and welcoming in the afternoon sun, its windows gleaming and its blue shutters bright as a summer sky. Soon it would welcome its first official guests, travelers seeking shelter and comfort in their growing community. But it would always be remembered as the place where 2 hearts had learned to trust again. The church doors opened, and the familiar strains of the wedding march filled the air. Kate felt James squeeze her arm reassuringly as they began their slow procession down the aisle. The sanctuary was packed with familiar faces, friends and neighbors who had watched their courtship unfold with interest and approval. But Kate saw none of them. Her attention was focused entirely on the man waiting for her at the altar, his tall frame impressive in a suit of deep blue wool, his hair carefully tamed for the occasion, his eyes bright with love and wonder as he watched her approach. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat as Kate moved toward him with graceful steps. She was beautiful beyond description, but more than that, she was his, the woman who had chosen to share her life with a rough-edged freight hauler who had never expected to deserve such happiness. Reverend Mills stood beaming behind the altar, his earlier doubts about their relationship completely forgotten in the face of their obvious devotion to each other. He had spent considerable time with both of them during their marriage preparation, and he had come to understand that their love was built on the solid foundation of shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection. As Kate reached the altar and James placed her hand D into Thomas's, the freight hauler felt a profound sense of completion wash over him. This was the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for his entire adult life, though he had only recently understood it. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but redemption, hope, and the promise of a shared future built on the strongest possible foundation." The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, but Thomas found himself barely hearing the familiar words. His attention was entirely focused on Kate's face, radiant beneath her mother's lace veil, her green eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. When the time came for them to speak their vows, Thomas's voice was steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Catherine," he said, using her full name, as he had that first day when he offered to help rebuild her home, "I promise to love you not just in the easy times, but in the difficult ones. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, to protect our family as you protected yours. I promise to choose you every day for all the days of my life." Kate's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice clear and strong as she spoke of second chances and unexpected blessings, of love that had grown from friendship and trust built through shared adversity. When she promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges life might bring, Thomas felt a certainty settled deep in his bones that this woman would indeed be his partner in every sense of the word. The exchange of rings was performed with Lucy and Samuel serving as witnesses, their young faces solemn with the importance of their roles. Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto Kate's finger, marveling at how right it looked there beside the engagement ring that had belonged to his mother. When Kate placed his ring on his finger, he felt the weight of commitment settle around him like a warm embrace. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and the grace of Almighty God," Reverend Mills declared with obvious pleasure, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was gentle and reverent, a seal on promises made before God and community. As they broke apart, the sanctuary erupted in applause and cheers, the sound echoing off the wooden rafters like a joyful thunderstorm. The reception that followed was held in the church courtyard, under garlands of wildflowers and ribbons that the women of the town had spent weeks preparing. Tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes contributed by every family in Millbrook, from Mrs. Henderson's famous fried chicken to old Mr. Jacobson's homemade beer that he had been aging in his cellar for just such an occasion. Thomas found himself constantly amazed by the warmth and generosity of the community's response to their marriage. These were the same people who had questioned and doubted them just months before, but adversity had revealed their true character, and they had rallied around love proven genuine by trial. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Thomas and Kate moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes with grace and gratitude. Sheriff Morrison pulled Thomas aside at one point to share news that Victor Caldwell had been denied an appeal and would serve his full sentence, bringing final closure to that dark chapter of their story. Justice has a way of prevailing, Morrison said with satisfaction, especially when good people stand together against those who would exploit their trust. The highlight of the reception came when James stood to offer a toast to the newlyweds. His words were simple but heartfelt, speaking of family bonds that transcended blood relationships and love that had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtyard. As evening approached and the guests began to drift away, Thomas and Kate found themselves sitting on the church steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley. Kate had removed her veil and shoes, and her silk dress was slightly wrinkled from dancing, but Thomas thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, testing out her new name and finding that he liked the sound of it. Kate smiled, leaning against his shoulder with a contentment that seemed to radiate from her very bones. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, Mr. Hayes, though I have to admit, it feels strange to have a different name after all these years." "You'll always be Kate to me," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "The woman who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right, despite being afraid." They sat in comfortable silence. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The boarding house stood visible from their vantage point, its windows glowing with lamplight, as James and the children prepared for the evening. "What are you thinking about?" Kate asked softly, noting the contemplative expression on her new husband's face. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "I was thinking about how different my life is now from what I thought it would be. A year ago, I was content with solitude, convinced that independence was the same thing as strength. I thought I had everything I needed. And now?" Kate prompted gently. "Now I know the difference between existing and living," Thomas replied. "You and the children, this community, the home we've built together, it's shown me what I was missing, without even knowing it. I thought I was strong because I could survive alone, but real strength comes from having people worth protecting, worth building something lasting for." Kate turned to study his profile in the fading light. "You know, I felt the same way after Michael died. I convinced myself that I could handle everything alone, that depending on anyone else was a weakness I couldn't afford. The fire that brought us together could have broken me completely, but instead it led me to you. Strange how life works," Thomas mused. "The worst thing that happened to you became the catalyst for the best thing that happened to both of us." As full darkness settled over Millbrook, the newlyweds made their way back to the boarding house that was now officially their shared home. The children had been put to bed hours earlier, exhausted by the excitement of the day, and James had tactfully retired to his own room to give the couple privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. The house welcomed them with familiar warmth, every room holding memories of the months they had spent building their relationship alongside the physical structure. Thomas paused in the front hallway, looking around at the home they had created, together from literal ashes. "I never thanked you properly," he said suddenly, turning to face Kate. "For what?" she asked, puzzled by the serious tone in his voice. "For seeing past the rough exterior to something worth saving, for trusting me when I didn't trust myself, for teaching me that love isn't something that weakens a person, but something that makes them stronger than they ever thought possible." Kate stepped closer, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. "Thomas Hayes, you saved my family from that fire, but more than that, you saved me from a life of mere survival. You showed me that it was possible to hope again, to dream again, to believe that happiness wasn't something that only happened to other people." Their second kiss as husband and wife was deeper and more passionate than the gentle seal they had shared at the altar, a promise of the intimacy and partnership that lay ahead. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and smiling with the joy of two people who had found their perfect match. The weeks that followed their wedding established a new rhythm for the Hayes household. Thomas had scaled back his freight business to focus on local deliveries, finding that he preferred the steady income and regular schedule to the long absences that had once defined his work. Kate threw herself into preparing the boarding house for its first paying guests, her natural gift for hospitality combining with Thomas's practical skills to create accommodations that quickly gained a reputation throughout the territory. Their first official boarder was a traveling photographer named Marcus Webb, a gentleman from Boston who was documenting the changing face of the American West. He stayed for 3 weeks, delighting the children with stories of his adventures and teaching Kate the basics of the photographic process. When he left, he presented them with a formal portrait of their family, the first official record of their life together. More guests followed, a steady stream of travelers, businessmen, and families seeking temporary lodging in the growing town. Kate's reputation as a hostess spread quickly, and by autumn they were booking reservations weeks in advance. The boarding house that had been born from tragedy was becoming a cornerstone of Millbrook's prosperity. But success in business paled beside the deeper satisfaction of their personal happiness. Thomas discovered that marriage to Kate was everything he had hoped and more than he had dared to expect. She was not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who understood the value of hard work and shared his vision for their future together. The children thrived under the stability of their new family structure. Lucy blossomed under Kate's patient guidance, developing skills in cooking and sewing that would serve her well in adulthood. Samuel, meanwhile, gravitated toward Thomas, learning the practical skills of carpentry and animal husbandry that were essential for frontier life. Both children seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something special in their aunt's second chance at happiness. James's own courtship of Sarah Mitchell progressed steadily through the autumn months, and by winter they were making plans for a spring wedding of their own. The prospect of another celebration in the Hayes household filled everyone with anticipation, and Kate threw herself into helping plan a ceremony that would be every bit as memorable as her own. One evening in late October, as the first snow of the season dusted the mountains and the air carried the crisp promise of winter, Thomas and Kate sat by the fire in their private sitting room, going over the accounts for the boarding house. Business had exceeded all their expectations, and they were already making plans to add additional rooms the following spring. "Look at this," Kate said with amazement, pointing to the neat columns of figures in her ledger book. "We've not only recovered the insurance money we spent on reconstruction, but we're showing a real profit. At this rate, we'll be able to expand sooner than we thought." Thomas smiled, setting aside his own paperwork to focus entirely on his wife. "Does that surprise you? You've created something special here, Kate. People don't just come for a room and good meals. They come for the warmth, the sense of family you provide. That's worth more than any price we could charge." Kate looked around the sitting room they had designed together, taking in the details that made it uniquely theirs. The comfortable chairs Thomas had crafted himself, the quilt she had sewn during the long winter evenings, the photographs and mementos that told the story of their blended family. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for in those dark days after Michael's death. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, voicing a fear that had lurked in the back of her mind despite all evidence to the contrary. "Regret what?" Thomas asked, genuinely puzzled. "Giving up your independence, your freedom to travel wherever the work took you, the solitary life you seemed to prefer before we met." Thomas set down his coffee cup and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Kate, listen to me carefully. The life I had before wasn't freedom. It was a prison, I was so afraid of being hurt that I shut myself off from everything that makes life worth living. You didn't take away my independence. You showed me what real strength looks like." His voice was intense with conviction, and Kate felt her doubts dissolve under the certainty in his eyes. "I love you, Thomas Hayes, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. And I love you, Catherine Hayes, every stubborn, courageous, beautiful part of you." As winter settled over Millbrook and the boarding house prepared for the quieter months ahead, Thomas and Kate found themselves looking forward to the luxury of time together without the constant demands of the busy season. There would be repairs to make and improvements to plan, but also long evenings by the fire, quiet conversations about their dreams and hopes, and the simple pleasure of waking up each morning knowing they faced the day together. The partnership they had forged in adversity had grown stronger through prosperity, proving that their love was built on a foundation solid enough to weather any storm. They had faced down gossip and false accusations, overcome the challenges of blending two lives into one, and created something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. As Thomas banked the fire for the night and Kate secured the house for sleep, both were thinking about the future they would continue to build together. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, but also joys they could hardly imagine. The boarding house would grow and prosper, the children would mature and find their own paths in life, and Thomas and Kate would face it all together, partners in every sense of the word. The house settled around them with the contented creaks and sighs of a structure that had found its purpose. In the bedrooms upstairs, Lucy and Samuel slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their family was whole and strong. James dreamed of his upcoming wedding to Sarah, while in the master bedroom, Thomas and Kate fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for the miracle of second chances and the transformative power of love. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the town in pristine white and promising a winter of quiet contentment for the family that had learned to make their own warmth against the cold. The boarding house stood proud and welcoming in the darkness, a beacon of hope for travelers seeking shelter and a testament to the enduring power of human resilience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they rested in the security of love, tested by fire and proven strong enough to last a lifetime. The wagon master, who had once carried only freight, had learned to carry something far more precious: the hopes and dreams of a family built not on blood, but on choice, not on obligation, but on love deep enough to transform two solitary souls into partners ready to face whatever the future might hold. Part 5, Forever Home. Spring returned to Millbrook with a symphony of renewal that seemed to echo the transformative journey of the Hayes family. Cherry trees burst into clouds of pink blossoms along Main Street, while the boarding house garden that Kate and Lucy had planned through the winter months began to show the first tender shoots of vegetables and herbs that would grace their table through the coming season. 2 years had passed since that August wedding day, and the boarding house had become more than a successful business venture. It had evolved into the heart of Millbrook's hospitality, a place where travelers found not just clean rooms and excellent meals, but genuine warmth and connection. Word of Kate's legendary apple pie and Thomas's reliable advice about mountain passes had spread throughout the territory, creating a steady stream of repeat customers who considered the Hayes establishment their home away from home. Thomas stood on the front porch in the early morning light, surveying the street that had become as familiar as his own reflection. The town itself had grown in response to the railroad line that James had helped survey, bringing new families and businesses that transformed Millbrook from a frontier settlement into a proper community. But for all the changes around them, the boarding house remained a constant, a symbol of stability and welcome that anchored the growing town. Planning. Another expansion already, Kate asked with gentle amusement as she joined him with 2 cups of steaming coffee. Her hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and the lines around her eyes spoke of laughter, shared and contentment earned through honest labor. Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, slipping his free arm around his wife's waist and pulling her close. Actually, I was thinking about something entirely different, something we've talked about but never seriously pursued. Kate looked up at him with curiosity, noting the thoughtful expression that had become familiar over their years together. What kind of something? Before Thomas could answer, the sound of wagon wheels on the street drew their attention. A familiar rig was approaching, driven by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the territory's first female physician who had arrived in Millbrook 6 months earlier and quickly established herself as an indispensable member of the community. But today, she was not alone. Beside her sat a young woman clutching a bundle that could only be an infant. Dr. Morrison reined her horse to a stop in front of the boarding house and climbed down with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. She was a woman in her 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. Her medical bag never left her side, and her presence in any situation immediately conveyed competence and compassion. "Good morning, Thomas, Kate," she called out with a smile that didn't quite hide the concern in her expression. "I wonder if I might impose on your hospitality for a rather unusual request." Kate set down her coffee cup and moved toward the wagon, her maternal instincts immediately responding to the sight of the young woman and child. "Of course, Doctor. What can we do to help?" Dr. Morrison helped her passenger down from the wagon. With gentle care, the young woman appeared to be no more than 18, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes that held the hollow look of someone who had endured more hardship than her years should have allowed. The baby in her arms was perhaps 3 months old, and even from a distance, Thomas could see that both mother and child were undernourished and exhausted. "This is Mary Sutton," Dr. Morrison explained quietly. "She arrived on the morning stage from Denver with her daughter Emma. Her husband was killed in a mining accident last month, and she has no family left to turn to. She needs a place to stay while we determine what assistance the community can provide." Kate stepped forward without hesitation, her face radiating the same welcome that had made the boarding house famous throughout the territory. "Of course, she can stay here. Come in, dear. You look like you need a good meal and a safe place to rest." Mary Sutton looked up at Kate with such gratitude that it brought tears to Thomas's eyes. "I can't pay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I spent my last coins on the stage fare to get here. Dr. Morrison said you might, that you were good people who helped those in need." "Payment is the last thing you need to worry about," Kate replied firmly, gently guiding the young mother toward the front door. "What you need is food, rest, and time to figure out your next steps. We have plenty of all 3. As they made their way inside, Thomas caught Dr. Morrison's arm. "How bad is their situation?" The doctor's expression was grave. "As bad as it gets. The husband was killed in a cave-in at the Golden Eagle mine, leaving no insurance and substantial debts. Mary was evicted from their cabin and had to sell everything just to buy passage here. She heard that Millbrook was a place where decent people looked after one another." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately why the doctor had brought Mary to their door. The boarding house had become known throughout the territory, not just for its hospitality, but for the Hayes family's willingness to help those who had nowhere else to turn. It was a reputation they had earned honestly, and one that Thomas wore with pride. Inside, Kate had already settled Mary and baby Emma in the sunny front room that served as both parlor and informal gathering place for guests. Lucy, now 10 years old, and Kate's eager assistant in all domestic matters, was already preparing a tray of warm milk and fresh bread, while Samuel, 8 and serious beyond his years, had volunteered to carry Mary's meager possessions to one of the guest rooms. "There now," Kate murmured soothingly as she helped Mary remove her worn traveling cloak. "Let's get some food into both of you, and then you can tell us your story when you're ready." Thomas watched his wife work her particular magic, creating an atmosphere of safety and acceptance that had the power to heal wounds that went far deeper than physical hunger. It was the same gift she had shared with him during those difficult months of rebuilding, the ability to see past surface circumstances to the person underneath and offer exactly what was needed most. As Mary ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who had not known when her next meal might come, she gradually began to share her story. It was a tale that had become all too common in the mining territories. A young couple chasing dreams of prosperity, a husband working dangerous jobs to support his growing family, a moment of carelessness or bad luck that destroyed everything in an instant. "Daniel thought the golden eagle was different," Mary said quietly, her voice gaining strength as Kate's gentle encouragement drew out the details. "He said the owners cared about safety, that the working conditions were better than most. But when the accident happened, they claimed it was his fault for not following proper procedures. They refused to pay compensation and demanded immediate payment of debts he had accumulated at the company store. Dr. Morrison, who had stayed to ensure Mary and the baby were in good health, shook her head with disgust. It's a pattern we see throughout the mining camps. Companies that exploit their workers in life and abandon their families in death." Thomas felt familiar anger rising in his chest, the same fury that had burned when Victor Caldwell had tried to destroy Kate's reputation for his own profit. There was something particularly vicious about those who preyed on people already struggling with tragedy and loss. "What are your plans now?" Kate asked gently, refilling Mary's cup with warm milk and honey. Mary's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her pale cheeks. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought maybe I could find work here, something that would let me keep Emma with me. I can cook and clean and sew. I'm not afraid of hard work." Kate and Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance, one of those wordless communications that had developed between them over the years of marriage. Without needing to discuss it, they both knew what needed to be done. "As it happens," Kate said with carefully casual tone, "we've been thinking about hiring additional help for the boarding house. The business has grown beyond what Thomas and I can manage alone, and we need someone reliable to assist with cooking and housekeeping." Mary looked up with desperate hope. "Do you mean, would you consider? But I have Emma to care for, and she's still nursing and—" "All the better," Thomas interjected with a smile. "Kate's been saying for months that this place needs the sound of a baby's laughter, and Lucy here has been begging for someone to practice her childcare skills on." Lucy nodded enthusiastically, her young face bright with excitement. "I could help with Emma. I know how to change diapers and sing lullabies and everything." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Mary stared at them with disbelief, as if afraid that accepting too quickly might cause the opportunity to vanish like a mirage. "You would do that?" she whispered. "You would let us stay, let me work to earn our keep?" Mary," Kate said with the gentle firmness that had once convinced Thomas to rebuild not just a house but his entire approach to life. "Everyone deserves a chance to build something better from whatever circumstances they find themselves in. Thomas and I know something about starting over after losing everything. If you're willing to work hard and become part of our family here, then we're more than willing to give you that chance." The transformation in Mary's face was immediate and profound. The hollow desperation was replaced by something Thomas recognized. Hope tempered with determination, the look of someone who had been given a reason to fight for a future, instead of merely surviving from day to day. "I won't let you down," Mary promised, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I'll earn my place here." "I have no doubt about that," Thomas replied warmly. "But right now, what you need to do is rest and recover your strength. There will be plenty of time for work once you and Emma are properly settled." As Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, satisfied that both mother and child were in excellent hands, she pulled Thomas aside for a private word. "You and Kate continue to amaze this community with your generosity." That young woman was at the end of her rope when she arrived this morning. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable as always with praise, for doing what seemed like basic human decency. "We've been fortunate. It seems only right to share that fortune with those who need it." "It's more than fortune, and you know it," Dr. Morrison replied. "It's choice. The choice to see the person behind the circumstances, to offer help without judgment, to build something better than what existed before. That's not common, Thomas, no matter how much we might wish it were." As the doctor departed and the household settled into its new rhythm with Mary and Emma as part of the family, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversation he and Kate had been having when Dr. Morrison arrived. The expansion he had been contemplating was not another addition to the boarding house, but something far more ambitious and meaningful. That evening, after Mary had been settled in a comfortable room with Emma sleeping peacefully in a cradle that Samuel had retrieved from the attic, Thomas and Kate found themselves alone on the front porch once again. The spring air was soft with the promise of summer, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. "You never finished telling me what you were thinking about this morning," Kate reminded him, settling into the rocking chair that had become her favorite spot for evening conversations. Thomas took a deep breath, gathering courage for a proposal that had been growing in his mind for months. "I've been thinking about what we've built here, Kate. Not just the boarding house, but the reputation we've earned for helping people who have nowhere else to turn. Mary's not the first person who's come to us in desperate circumstances, and she won't be the last." Kate nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Patterson, when her husband died and left her with 4 children. Old Mr. Hines, when he lost his farm to the bank. The Kowalski family, when they arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and dreams of starting over." "Exactly," Thomas said, warming to his theme. "And each time we've done what we could to help, but it's been informal, unorganized. I've been wondering if we shouldn't make it official." "Official how?" Nodded. Thomas moved to the porch railing, looking out at the town that had become their home and community. "What if we established a formal program, a way for people in crisis to find not just temporary shelter, but real assistance in rebuilding their lives? We have the space, the reputation, the connections throughout the territory. We could make a real difference." Kate was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what he was suggesting. "It would be a big undertaking. We'd need additional funding, probably formal recognition from the territorial government, partnerships with other communities." "All of that could be arranged," Thomas replied. "James has connections with the railroad that could help with transportation. Dr. Morrison has contacts with medical facilities throughout the region. Sheriff Morrison knows which communities are most in need of assistance." "And you've already been thinking about this quite seriously," Kate observed, with a smile that held equal parts admiration and amusement. Thomas turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Kate, we've been blessed beyond measure. We have a successful business, a loving family, the respect of our community. But more than that, we've learned something about the power of second chances, about what's possible when people are willing to help each other build something better." Kate rose from her chair and moved to stand beside her husband, slipping her hand into his. "You want to create something that could help others the way this community helped us." "Exactly," Thomas said, squeezing her hand gently. "A place where people like Mary can find not just charity but opportunity, where families can rebuild their lives with dignity and support, where no one has to face their darkest hour alone. Kate was quiet for several minutes, and Thomas could practically hear her mind working through the practical details and potential challenges. It was one of the things he loved most about her, her ability to dream big while keeping her feet firmly planted in reality. It would mean expanding our mission beyond simple hospitality, she said finally. We'd be taking on responsibility for people's futures, not just their immediate needs. Yes, Thomas agreed. But isn't that what we've been doing all along? Informally. The difference would be doing it systematically with proper resources and support. Kate turned to study his face in the lamplight spilling from the house windows. You really believe we could make this work? I believe we could try, Thomas replied. And I believe that sometimes trying is enough to create something extraordinary. Kate smiled, the expression that had first captured his heart during those difficult months of rebuilding. Then let's do it. Let's create something that honors the help we received by extending it to others who need it. The decision felt momentous and completely natural at the same time, as if they had been building toward this moment through all the choices that had brought them together. The boarding house that had begun as Kate's desperate attempt to rebuild, her life had evolved into something far greater, a symbol of hope for anyone who had lost their way and needed help finding it again. As they made their way inside to begin planning this new chapter of their shared mission, both Thomas and Kate felt the satisfaction of purpose aligned with possibility. They had learned through their own struggles that redemption was always possible, that love could grow in the harshest soil, and that sometimes the most beautiful things emerged from the ashes of what had been lost. The boarding house settled around them with familiar comfort, sheltering not just their own family, but Mary and Emma, and soon many others who would find their way to this place of second chances and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve, but tonight they rested in the knowledge that they had found their true calling, creating a home not just for themselves, but for anyone brave enough to believe that their story could have a different ending. Outside, spring rain began to fall gently, nourishing the garden they had planted together and promising abundant growth in the season ahead. Inside, the family that had been forged through loss and strengthened. Through love prepared for the future, they would build together. One act of kindness, one extended hand, one open door at a time. The wagon master, who had once carried only freight, had learned to carry something far more precious. Hope itself, transported from heart to heart, from family to family, from one small town to a territory full of people who simply needed someone to believe in their capacity for renewal. And in that mission, Thomas and Kate Hayes had found not just purpose, but the deepest satisfaction that comes from a life lived in service to something greater than oneself. 5 years had transformed the Hayes Haven from an ambitious dream into a beacon of hope that drew visitors from across 3 territories. The original boarding house had grown into a complex of buildings that could accommodate 50 families at a time, complete with workshops where newcomers could learn trades, a school where children could continue their education regardless of their family's circumstances, and a medical clinic staffed by Dr. Morrison and 2 additional physicians who had been inspired to join their mission. Thomas stood at the window of his office in the administration building, watching the morning activities unfold across the compound with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his true calling. In the main courtyard, Mary Sutton was leading a group of recently arrived women through orientation, her 5-year-old daughter Emma playing nearby with other children whose families had found refuge at the Haven. Mary had grown from a desperate young mother into one of their most capable administrators, her own experience with loss and renewal making her uniquely qualified to guide others through similar transitions. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Thomas from his contemplation. Kate entered the office carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the practical blue dress that had become her uniform for the serious business of running their expanded operation. At 38, she had grown into her role as director of the Haven with the same natural grace that had made her boarding house famous throughout the territory. "The territorial inspector is here," she announced, setting the coffee on his desk and moving to stand beside him at the window. "Governor Martinez sent him to evaluate our application for official status as a territorial relief organization." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the slight tension in Kate's voice. Official recognition would bring substantial funding and legislative protection for their work, but it would also mean increased scrutiny and bureaucratic oversight that could potentially compromise the personal approach that made the Haven so effective. "Nervous?" he asked, slipping his free arm around her waist in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Cautiously optimistic," Kate replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "We've helped over 300 families rebuild their lives in 5 years. The success stories speak for themselves. But I worry that government officials might not understand the importance of treating each person as an individual rather than a case number." Through the window, they could see Inspector Harrison making his way across the courtyard with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to evaluating institutions. He was a lean, serious-looking individual in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of precise demeanor that suggested he had spent his career in government service. His assistant followed behind, taking notes and occasionally stopping to examine specific aspects of the facility. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," Harrison said formally as he entered the office, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "I'm Inspector Charles Harrison from the Territorial Relief Commission. I trust you've been expecting me." Thomas stepped forward to shake the man's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested intelligence and integrity. "Inspector Harrison, welcome to Hayes Haven. We're honored to have your attention and eager to show you what we've accomplished here." Harrison nodded curtly, consulting a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. "I've reviewed your preliminary application and supporting materials. The scope of your operation is impressive, as are the testimonial letters from families you've assisted. However, I need to conduct a thorough evaluation of your facilities, procedures, and outcomes before I can make my recommendation to the territorial government." Kate moved to the large map that covered one wall of the office, pointing to colored pins that marked the locations where former Haven residents had successfully established new lives. "Perhaps we could begin with an overview of our placement. Results. Each pin represents a family that came to us in crisis and left with the skills and resources needed to become self-sufficient." Harrison studied the map with obvious interest, noting the geographic spread that covered mining camps, farming communities, and growing towns throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico territories. "Your success rate appears remarkably high. What do you attribute that to?" "Individual attention," Thomas replied without hesitation. "We don't have a standard program that we apply to everyone who comes through our doors. Instead, we assess each family's specific situation, skills, and goals, then design a support plan that addresses their particular needs." Harrison made a note in his portfolio. "That sounds admirable in theory, but also expensive and difficult to standardize. How do you ensure consistent quality when each case receives unique treatment?" Kate exchanged a quick glance with Thomas before answering. This was the heart of their philosophy, the principle that had guided their work from the beginning, but was difficult to explain to someone who thought in terms of bureaucratic efficiency. "Inspector, we've learned that people in crisis don't need standardized solutions. They need someone to see them as individuals with unique strengths and challenges. A widow with 4 children requires different support than a young couple starting over after a business failure. A family fleeing religious persecution has different needs than miners displaced by industrial accidents. But surely there are common elements that could be systematized, Harrison pressed. Basic job training, literacy education, financial, planning skills. Of course, Thomas agreed. And we provide all of those things. But we provide them in the context of relationships built on trust and mutual respect. People don't just need skills, they need someone to believe in their ability to succeed. Harrison spent the next 3 hours touring the facility with Thomas and Kate, examining everything from the dormitory accommodations to the workshops, where residents learned carpentry, tailoring, farming techniques, and basic business skills. He interviewed staff members, observed classes in session, and spoke at length with current residents about their experiences and future plans. In the medical clinic, Dr. Morrison explained their approach to treating not just physical ailments, but the emotional trauma that often accompanied the crises that brought families to the haven. "We've found that healing the whole person is essential to successful rehabilitation," she told Harrison. "Someone who has lost everything often struggles with depression, anxiety, and loss of self-worth that can sabotage their efforts to rebuild." Harrison's assistant took detailed notes as they visited the children's school, where Lucy Hayes had established herself as head teacher despite being only 15 years old. Her natural gift for education had blossomed under Kate's guidance, and she now managed a curriculum that served children from ages 5 to 17, many of whom had never had consistent schooling before arriving at the Haven. "The children are often the key to successful family rehabilitation," Lucy explained with the confidence that came from 5 years of experience. "When children feel safe and start learning again, it gives their parents hope and motivation to persevere through the difficult process of starting over." Samuel, now 13, and showing every sign of following his adoptive father into construction work, was leading a group of teenage boys in building a new workshop that would house expanded vocational training programs. His easy competence with tools and natural leadership abilities had made him an unofficial mentor to other young men who arrived at the Haven feeling lost and purposeless. As the tour continued, Harrison began to understand that what the Hayes family had created was something unprecedented in territorial relief work. Rather than a temporary shelter or training facility, they had built a complete community designed to restore not just people's practical circumstances, but their sense of dignity and self-worth. The turning point in Harrison's evaluation came during his interview with Mary Sutton, who had agreed to share her story as an example of the Haven's impact. She spoke with quiet eloquence about arriving 5 years earlier as a desperate young mother with no resources and no hope, and leaving 18 months later as a confident woman with marketable skills and a clear vision for her future. "They didn't just give me a job and a place to stay," Mary explained, little Emma playing quietly at her feet while her mother spoke. "They helped me remember who I was underneath all the fear and desperation. Mrs. Hayes worked with me to identify my strengths, and Mr. Hayes taught me that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. By the time I was ready to leave, I knew I could handle whatever challenges life might bring." Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his official demeanor softening slightly. "And you chose to return here rather than pursue other opportunities?" Mary smiled, glancing through the window at the bustling courtyard where she now guided other families through their own transformations. "I realized that what I learned here wasn't just about surviving or even succeeding. It was about understanding that we all have something to offer, that our own struggles can become the foundation for helping others. This place gave me back my life, and now I get to be part of giving that gift to other families." That evening, as Harrison prepared his preliminary report in the guest quarters, Thomas and Kate found themselves on the familiar front porch of the original boarding house, now serving as their private residence within the larger complex. The sounds of family life drifted from the various buildings around them, a symphony of conversation, laughter, and the everyday activities of people building new lives. "What do you think he'll recommend?" Kate asked, settling into the rocking chair that had witnessed so many important conversations over the years. Thomas considered the question carefully, replaying the day's interactions in his mind. I think he was skeptical when he arrived, expecting to find either naive idealism or hidden problems, but he's intelligent enough to recognize effectiveness when he sees it. "The numbers certainly support our approach," Kate mused. 87% of families who complete our program achieve long-term stability. That's unprecedented in territorial relief work. "More than that," Thomas added, "most of them go on to help others in their new communities. We're not just solving immediate problems. We're creating a network of people who understand the value of compassion and mutual support." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the evening stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The simple boarding house that had brought them together had become the nucleus of something neither had dared to imagine in those early days of rebuilding and hope. "Thomas," Kate said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to investigate that fire 7 years ago?" Thomas reached for her hand, finding the familiar comfort of her fingers intertwined with his. "Every day I'm grateful that I made the choice to get involved instead of minding my own business. We've helped so many people rebuild their lives," Kate continued, "but sometimes I think the person who was transformed most by this work was me. I went from being a woman who lost everything to someone who discovered that true wealth comes from what you're able to give away." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Inspector Harrison's arrival. He had requested a final meeting to discuss his preliminary findings, and his expression suggested that his conclusions were both definitive and significant. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he began formally, then seemed to reconsider his tone. "Thomas, Kate, if I may. I've completed my evaluation, and I want to share my findings with you before I submit my official report." They gestured for him to join them on the porch, and Harrison settled into the third rocking chair with the air of a man who had reached an important decision. "In 23 years of evaluating relief organizations, I've never encountered anything quite like what you've built here." Thomas felt Kate's hand tighten slightly in his, and he could sense her holding her breath as they waited for Harrison's assessment. Most institutions of this type focus on immediate crisis intervention or basic job training, Harrison continued. They measure success in terms of how quickly they can move people through their programs and back into independent living. But what I've observed here goes far beyond that. Harrison paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "You've created something that addresses the root causes of why people end up in crisis situations in the first place. The combination of practical skills, training, emotional support, community building, and long-term follow-up produces outcomes that frankly seem too good to be true." Kate found her voice. "But they are true. Every statistic in our application can be verified independently." "Oh, I don't doubt your numbers," Harrison replied with a slight smile. "What impressed me was discovering the stories behind those numbers. The widow who became a successful seamstress and now employs other women in her community. The former miner who used the agricultural training he received here to establish a cooperative farm that supports 12 families. The young man who arrived here, illiterate and angry, and left as a teacher who's opening schools in remote mining camps." Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Those are the successes that matter most to us. Not just helping people survive their immediate crisis, but helping them discover their potential to contribute something meaningful to the world. Harrison nodded emphatically. Exactly, and that's why I'm recommending not just approval for territorial status, but designation as a model program that should be replicated throughout the Western Territories. The words hung in the evening air like a promise of possibilities neither Thomas nor Kate had dared to imagine. Official recognition would bring funding, protection, and the opportunity to expand their mission far beyond what they could accomplish alone. There will be conditions, of course, Harrison continued. Regular inspections, standardized reporting requirements, oversight from territorial authorities. But I'll be recommending that you retain complete operational autonomy, as long as your outcomes continue to meet or exceed current standards. Kate felt tears welling in her eyes as the implications of Harrison's recommendations sank in. This means we could help so many more families. We could establish satellite programs in other communities, train more staff, expand our capacity. It also means increased responsibility and scrutiny, Thomas pointed out, though his voice carried excitement rather than concern. We'll need to be even more careful about maintaining the personal approach that makes our work effective. Harrison stood to leave, but paused at the porch steps to look back at the complex of buildings that housed over 40 families in various stages of rebuilding their lives. You know, when I started this job, I thought relief work was about providing temporary assistance until people could get back on their feet. But watching your operation has taught me that real relief work is about helping people discover they were never really broken in the first place. As Harrison departed and the sounds of evening settled over the haven, Thomas and Kate remained on the porch, processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished and what lay ahead. The boarding house where their own love story had begun was now the heart of an operation that had touched hundreds of lives and would soon reach thousands more. "Are you ready for this?" Kate asked, squeezing Thomas's hand as they watched lights begin to appear in windows throughout the complex. "With you as my partner," Thomas replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "I'm ready for anything." A year later, the Hayes Haven model had been adopted by 6 other communities across the territories, with Thomas and Kate traveling regularly to train new staff and share the principles that had made their work so successful. The original facility continued to operate at capacity, but now it also served as a training center for relief workers from across the western United States. Mary Sutton had been promoted to regional coordinator, overseeing the expansion program while raising Emma and the son she had recently welcomed with her new husband, a former Haven resident who had become a successful blacksmith. Lucy had accepted a scholarship to attend Teachers College in Denver, but planned to return and establish an advanced education program for older students. Samuel was apprenticing with a master carpenter while helping design the next generation of Haven facilities. On a warm spring evening, exactly 8 years after the fire that had brought them together, Thomas and Kate stood once again on the porch of their original boarding house. The complex around them bustled with the activities of families rebuilding their lives, children learning and playing, and staff members who had found their own calling in service to others. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Kate asked, her voice soft with memory, "about sometimes a person gets a chance to do something right?" Thomas smiled, his arm tightening around his wife as they watched their extended family of choice going about the evening routines of a community built on hope and mutual support. "I had no idea how right we could make it, or how many lives we'd be able to touch." In the distance, a new group of travelers was arriving, their wagon loaded with possessions and faces marked by the exhaustion and uncertainty that had become familiar signs to the Haven staff. Tomorrow, these newcomers would begin their own journey from crisis to renewal, guided by people who understood their struggles because they had traveled the same difficult path. The boarding house that had been born from ashes had become something far greater than either Thomas or Kate had ever imagined possible. It stood as proof that love could indeed grow in the harshest soil, that second chances were always worth taking, and that the most beautiful things in life often emerged from the deepest losses. As they made their way inside to prepare for another day of serving those who needed hope most, both Thomas and Kate carried with them the quiet satisfaction of lives lived in service to something greater than themselves. They had learned that true success was measured not in personal achievements, but in the number of other people whose lives were made better by your presence in the world. The wagon master, who had once carried only freight, now carried something infinitely more precious, the dreams and hopes of countless families who had discovered that their stories could have different endings than they had feared. And in that mission, he and his remarkable wife had found not just purpose, but the deepest joy that comes from knowing that your life has made a lasting difference in the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.